The Great Unravelling, Democracy and Development in the Age of Populism. I have with me the esteemed Lord Malloch Brown and Sir Andrew Mitchell. They need very little introduction from me, but Lord Malloch Brown was previously served as the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations under Kofi Annan, and is currently President of the Open Societies Foundation. And Sir Mitchell is a storied and seasoned British Conservative Member of Parliament and former Deputy Foreign Secretary. Both gentlemen have dedicated their professional careers to global aid in development, diplomacy, and humanitarian causes. And really join us today to take a closer look at the consequences of weakened global partnerships, the shrinking civic space, and the erosion of trust in democratic values. Really, what we'd like to do today is explore the question of, can the democratic project survive an age of polarization and retreat, or are we witnessing the end of an era? And if so, what's going to fill that gap? And so perhaps I can start, and I'm going to leave about 10, 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience, but starting with the unraveling of development
infrastructure.
Perhaps we can start with recent developments from my side of the pond, across the pond. USAID is all but dismantled. What does that dismantling signal for the future of global development leadership? And then moving to this side of the pond, are there similar aid cuts on this side of the pond, which then collectively signal that the West may be done with its post-World War II experiment? And there should be microphones. You should have one in your chair.
Well,
yeah.
Look, I'll go first, only because I can say a nice thing about Andrew and the Tory government that was the government when he was Secretary of State for International Development that lifted us to the target of 0.7. Inherited a path, I have to say, from the Labour government, of which I was a proud part, that immediately preceded it. But nevertheless, there was a period, only a decade or more, a little more ago, when both political parties essentially competed and cooperated to make development assistance a very generous part of their offering to their electorates. And there was a sort of combined sort of vision, particularly for, at the time, younger voters, which showed up in the polling, that as tribal loyalties to a particular party weakened, the commitment of the party they chose to vote to around issues like international development assistance was critical in determining how a great cohort of voters chose. And even to a lesser extent, that was the case in the US. That's gone. This Labour government has just cut aid here to 0.3. The previous Tory government had cut it back to 0.5. There's been remarkably little public reaction to that. And as Nabila said, in the US, a dramatic, almost overnight closure of the doors of USAID. At least here it's phased in over 2 years. And in the case of USAID, particularly in the area of public health and food security, both of which have an immediate impact on life. You can actually track real lives endangered, almost certainly, possibly hundreds of thousands of lives lost, suspension of HIV treatments in southern Africa, insufficient food into countries like Sudan in the grip of a major civil war, etc. So, it is a complete collapse of a system which not just provided, or at least a denting and large collapse of a system which didn't just provide that kind of emergency life support, but which at its best was part of whole countries and regions lifting themselves permanently out of poverty. We came from the last decade of the last century through the first decade of this century. It was a period in human history when poverty was reduced more, life expectancy increased more, educational outcomes and health outcomes improved more than in any other 20 years of world history. And primarily that was about the actions of the governments involved, but aid, development assistance, was a critical partner to that. So there is a way forward, but let me just stop for now on that, description of the situation, the sad situation we face today.
Sir Mitchell.
So I agree entirely with what Mark has just said. Let me just add a couple of points to that. When I became the Development Secretary in 2010, when the coalition government was first elected, there was this sort of glorious period which Mark described. I used to irritate the Labour Party when they were in government and we were in opposition by saying that this is not a Labour or Tory or Liberal policy on development. It's a British policy, and it is one of the few areas, I think, which people would say demonstrated real British accepted leadership. In fact, I would argue that on development, since Suez, actually, it was the only area of undisputed British leadership around the world on international development. And it wasn't just about the money, although, as Mark said, we stuck to our promise in the days of austerity after 2010. We stuck to our promise about the 0.7. I was incredibly proud to be a member of a government which, in spite of that austerity, stood by their promises to the poorest people in the world. And the way we expressed it is we acknowledged that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown had done a very good job on this, and we hoped that under David Cameron, if you like, that they had laid the foundations and we would build the first floor, and it would be a seamless British all-party policy. And as Mark said, from 1990 really till almost 2020, we saw this extraordinary alleviation of poverty around the world, the fastest ever in human history, all of which has gone now, or very largely gone, because of the cuts which Mark described. And, when a Labour government, having condemned without qualification the cut from 0.7 to 0.5, then cuts it from 0.5 to 0.3, when their backbenchers, many of whom had got elected on the back of promising to try and restore the 0.7, and that's why they were selected by their general management Labour committees, when they hardly make any noise at all, and when the polls tell you that cutting aid was the most popular thing Keir Starmer's government has done, you realise that all the air is being sort of sucked out of the room. And what many of us who care a great deal about this are doing now is we're trying to work out how we make the case for development in the future. In Britain, much of the support for development comes from people who believe it's the right thing to do. Something like 50% of the population more or less support development. The other 50% don't believe we should send our money overseas. And how do you win that battle? Because we've comprehensively failed, really. But Mark is the key in one sense, because no one knows more about international development than Lord Malloch Brown. And also, he was, of course, in the public relations industry, and he once got a non-Bolivian elected as president of Bolivia. So we are all of us, we are all of us hoping that he has the answer of how we re-engage with the public. And I think, to some extent, it's about national interest. There's some very clever people at Birmingham University and in London at UCL who say that the way to do it is to appeal to people's moral values. But we think we've hoovered up all the people for that, and we need to make a case on national interest. And of course, the case on national interest, this is why it's such a mistake to have cut aid as Labour has done, and vaporised DFID, which was an appalling act by Johnson when he was Prime Minister, vaporising what was acknowledged, not because of the money, but because of the conglomeration of expertise to be the greatest engine of poverty alleviation in any government around the world. The effect of all these changes has been greatly to diminish what Britain is trying to do. And the case, I think, has to be that if you want to tackle migration, if you want to tackle disease, if you want to tackle climate change, That is what development is about. And development is the other side of the coin from defense. Soft power is much cheaper than hard power. Nipping conflict in the bud is an awful lot cheaper than fighting wars. And so the national interest argument, I think, is probably where it needs to go. And of course, I'm sure we're going to come on to talking about the international system and the United Nations, but at a time when, in order to tackle all those things, you need intensive international cooperation. You've got the very reverse of that. You've got the rule of narrow nationalists. Look around the world, from Xi to Trump and so on. These are narrow nationalists in power. The very obverse, in my view, of what we need. And I just end these opening remarks with this. I for my degree, read history, not very much of it, and not very well, but it looks to me, it feels as though it's a sort of reverted to pre-1914. Before 1914 and the First World War, there were big countries with their zones of interest. I think that's something that Trump feels quite strongly. And then we had the First World War, and we had the slaughter in Europe, in France, and the Western Front. And my grandfather's generation determined that we simply couldn't go on like this. We needed a strong international system to stand above these narrow nationalist wars. And so they invented the League of Nations. And then the League of Nations created in the 30s, and then we had the Second World War. And my father's generation said, we can't go on like this. We need a United Nations. And the United Nations was set up. And I'm a great fan of the UN. I was a United Nations peacekeeping soldier when I was very much younger in the British Army. And I have immense respect for the UN. And I think people misunderstand the UN because Mark, of course, knows all this backwards, but I think that phrase that the UN won't get you to heaven, but it may stop you from going to hell is absolutely right. But we now see the UN maybe fatally wounded by its failure to modernize the post-World War II settlement, and by Putin, one of the permanent five, brutally invading his neighbor, something we thought we consigned to the history books in the last century, butchering its citizens, bombing its infrastructure. So the international system is hugely on the back foot just at a time when we really need it.
So actually, we're going to come to that in a minute. But I think before, and the death of multilateralism. But before we go there, let's sink deeper. You mentioned a number of UK leaders, and then you did also bring up Trump. Let's talk about these populist leaders and the populist movement and what it's doing to undermine these institutions that we will come to talk about momentarily. But what is their role in sort of like popularizing the demonization of these international organizations like the United Nations, like the World Bank, like the IMF? And how does populism then end up eroding public support for for international cooperation and international development? And what are the lessons that we've learned from Brexit, Trumpism, et al.? So we'll come to the individual organizations shortly, but perhaps you can talk about these populist leaders and their role and what they've done to, sort of like the communal psyche. Yes.
Well, the problem is that the public have lost faith in their politicians, really. I think this is something which started a long time ago, but it's intensified. The last government suffered of which I was a part, suffered a very serious defeat almost exactly a year ago, and doesn't really yet have a voice. The public think that they've dispatched the Tories, and indeed when the Tory spokesmen appear on television, I think there's a sense in the public of, why am I seeing them? We got rid of them a year ago. And it will take another year for the Tories to re-find a voice that is listened to, I think. And it will have to be on the economy, because that is the key thing that people expect the Tories to get right, and we made plenty of mistakes on that in the last government. Now then they've got this Labour government, which I'm trying not to make a partisan point here, but I don't see much of a strategy in this Labour government. And so the public find in the two main parties They're dissatisfied with that, and you see this in the polls, and you have the siren voice of Nigel Farage and the populists who ventilate grievances, but they don't have solutions. And where they do have solutions, it's to cut tax for everyone and massively increase expenditure on some area of public expenditure. So that's not a policy, that's a movement. And they ventilate grievance. And I think that is the climate we are living in. I would argue that the public is restless with politicians who don't deliver, but it's very difficult sometimes to deliver, and decisions in government, as I hope Mark would agree, are often the least bad option that you're looking at. There's no good option. You have to go for the least bad option. And in terms of coming directly to your question, if you look, for example, at these boats that are coming across the sea, the modern day equivalent of the slave trader, packing these people into leaky boats, some of them dying, then coming to Britain, that is completely unacceptable to the British public. And I would argue no government that doesn't deal with that is going to get re-elected. And the cure for that is not at the Channel. The cure for that is miles upstream. This is where international development comes in, where the international institutions come in. And anyone who thinks that you can deal with that as one nation is completely wrong. The answer is upstream. In my view, it's to have the sort of modern-day equivalent of a Marshall Plan in North Africa, so that instead of having enormous numbers of people who don't have a job who are looking to move to Fortress Europe, you have a system, a carrot and stick approach, where you train people there so they can help build their countries, and also people can then come across to Europe, which is a continent where we have diminishing populations, so we need that help, coming from North Africa, where they have burgeoning, increasing populations, and so forth. And then the final point is this, that what are the international conventions that can help? Well, you're driven then back to the 1951 Geneva Convention, which is completely out of date, and which those who look at this and know about these things amongst the public see that international system is not fit for purpose in terms of conquering a problem they know that everyone is deeply concerned about. So it is the failure of the international system to deliver, to be part of the solution for these, what are domestic issues, which can only be dealt with on an international basis when the system has moved away from doing that.
Well, look, I mean, I think we've got to put, as Andrew did at the end there, you know, the crisis in British politics into the context of a global crisis in politics. And, you know, I've been doing some work on behalf of two international institutions, the leaders of them, two which last year had their 80th birthday, the World Bank and the IMF, and, you know, trying to work out, along with two others, an Indonesian finance minister and a former African prime minister, you know, what the future of these two institutions is. And, you know, you don't go through an exercise like that without realizing that the crisis is global. And, you know, there is we had consultations all over the world, and various quotes kept on coming up. Gramsci, you know, a long-dead political philosopher, was constantly being quoted to us with various things that he'd said about the old order is dead and the new one is not yet born, and we're living in a terrible moment of uncertainty. And, you know, this thematic came almost everywhere around the world in the discussions we held, other than in Asia, which has a degree of optimism about the future which is missing almost everywhere else in the world. And, you know, behind it lies these dramatic structural changes in the nature of employment and society wherever we live. If you're living in a poor country, in Africa, for example, the sort of smokestack model towards industrialization with export-led growth, which allowed this part of Britain to lead our 19th century domination of the global economy, or the Americans who came afterwards, or most recently the Chinese and Southeast Asia, who've had an industrial export-driven growth model. That path is closed. We're moving into a very different economy, and it is implausible to imagine smokestack industries rising across Africa. Now, there's a huge silver lining to that. Who wants smokestack industries if you can escape that stage of development? But people are having much difficulty working out what the alternative is. And then you come to the old industrial giants, once the UK, more recently, obviously the US, and you've got this deep malaise in the politics, a deep sense of grievance of certain groups feeling that they're getting left behind, overlooked, and that the new economic changes are distributing benefits in a very different way to in the past. And now you're piling onto that new factors like climate change. Just this week, one of the leaders, the guy who started Anthropic, one of the AI businesses, is, warning of a 40% cut in white-collar employment. Let alone what it does to many much more routine factory tasks in, more industrial employment across the world, or in, less skilled service sectors. And so, there is a sense of economic insecurity everywhere. So just one closing observation about what that means for British politics, and I say this as a former, somebody who sat at the Labour, in a Labour cabinet. I think we have to really seriously worry and fear that this Labour government is not the first government of a new beginning for Britain, but the last government of an old breakdown for Britain. That we really may face something much closer to what we're seeing in American politics, the turbulence of a populist period of leadership, before, we sober up and grip our future seriously. And, America, a country I love and have lived many, like you, Nabila, many large part of my adult life in, is no longer the America I recognized and knew, and that as a young graduate student I went to thinking I was leaving old Europe behind and going to a land of opportunity, and, your efforts would be rewarded, and, that you were being invited into a country of immigrants. And, all of that is gone.
Indeed, and having spent almost over 3 decades living in the Midwest, it is not a country I recognize. I went over there to teach, and now it looks like, the very foundations of the academic institutions there have just completely eroded. And it's a depressing thought to think that what's happening there is coming this way, and I dare say that it is. Both of you touched on international organizations that really formed the cornerstone of the rebuilding of the world post-World War II. And I dare say that multilateralism is in crisis and is breaking down. How, or do institutions like the United Nations, which I dare say is now a toothless tiger, the World Bank, G7, etc., do they still have relevance? Can they come back from the erosion that they have suffered? And if not, are there other emerging regional or civil society-led forms of institutions that could replace them? Where are we going? Can you predict where we're going, other than just complete populist crisis?
Now we're on to my subject. So, Minister, I'll go first on this one. I think it's time for the UN to go into opposition. And what I mean by that is it's time for the UN to escape the ownership of the permanent 5 members, particularly the US, Russia, and China, But along with that, I think probably the British and French as well, the other two P5 members, who've always been also RANs within that grouping. At a moment when the US and Russia are competing as to which is the bigger international outlaw on, issues of the rule of law, basic principles of respecting the sovereignty of other member states, just a whole set of norms and values. As both those countries run away from it, it's not that the UN should formally divorce them and tell them you're out. There are mechanisms where if Trump were to carry through on his instinct not to pay even the minimum dues that the US is due the UN, that their voting membership might be suspended. But I don't think that's useful to literally exclude them and blackball them. But the UN and its leadership needs to say, who are our real constituency? And the two critical constituencies are smaller countries, and by that I don't mean small island states. I mean very large countries in some cases, but which are not global superpowers, all of whom, as they see these two major powers behaving in an ever more lawless way, actually have, if they're smart about it and clear-sighted about it, a redoubled interest in asserting against this new kind of concert of power, 19th century theory of interests over values that Putin and Trump are exerting, of actually standing up the original 1945 vision of a rule of law based global membership where small and big countries alike had the same rules to appeal to in order to govern relations between them. And I would invite in a second constituency that Kofi Annan and I did a lot to try and draw into the UN, which was civil society. There have always been a large hardcore of member states who've resisted this, who've said, the Charter is about a member state-based institution. But as we see critical Charter values like human rights under attack, or the ability to tackle future problems like climate challenged by these big powers, the smaller powers need all the help they can get. And to make more space for a kind of fourth estate, to borrow the language of the French Revolution, a chamber for civil society, where that voice can be heard too in these institutions is key. And so I imagine a much more campaigning United Nations in the future, where on big issues, it has a Secretary General and leadership not of staid diplomats, but of a much more political leadership, which will lead on these global issues and build coalitions to support them and be much less deferential to the original founders than has been the case before. Now, there are lots of constitutional issues around that and hidden sort of tripwires in the Charter, which will make it very difficult, including the role of the P5 in electing the next Secretary General. But, it's time for the UN to get its elbows out and fight for that kind of place and space.
So you're suggesting that revolution is what you're suggesting?
Broadly, yes.
Evolution.
Revolution.
So I mean, Mark is the master of this, and what he says, I'm sure is right. The question is this. In the 3 Tons public house in the centre of the royal town of Sutton Coldfield, if you went in today and you said, we really need an international system, we really need the UN because, no one's going to give you an answer. And we need it to become more relevant. We need it to escape from the 1945 victors. We need not to have the United Nations Human Rights Committee run by people like Saudi Arabia and China or Sudan. We need an organization which is reflective of we the people. I think we the people is how it starts, but as you said, it's a nation-state organization. And back in 2010, we set up the Multilateral Aid Review, which was asking people, or we were asking ourselves really, do we get value for money from the 43 UN agencies to which the British taxpayer is contributing? And we looked, first of all, at whether they delivered value for money, and we then looked at whether they were pursuing interests which Britain thought was important and right. And a lot of them were. In fact, we thought that UNICEF was so good that we doubled UNICEF's core grant. But we thought that about 10% of them we thought were completely useless from Britain's point of view, and we withdrew funding. Now, when we did that, it has to be said that most of the people at the UN didn't believe we would do it, and they couldn't understand how we were imposing such rigor on the job that they had been doing to a greater or lesser extent well for many, many years. But that approach, I think, was the right approach, because it's the start of answering that question in the 3 Tons public house. Why do we need an international system, and is it fit for purpose, and is it delivering? And for all the reasons that Mark set out, it isn't at the moment. I'm slightly disappointed that Antonio Guterres hasn't done more to address this in his second term, which of course is when he would have more heft than in his first term, because he has to get re-elected. It is extraordinarily difficult, and it's made more difficult for him to do that by the collapse in the international, in many of the sinews of the international system, which we've both been describing.
You know, revolutions are all well and good, but they tend to be writ in blood and require money. And the organizations that you are suggesting perhaps come to arise are short on both money and blood. You know, so then what role does a mid-sized power like the United Kingdom have in restabilizing institutions like the United Nations? And we've focused a great deal on the United Nations, but I would like to bring us back to other organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, etc. If you can speak to those as well.
Look, I mean, I think the UN itself, which, by the way, was 80 this week, it is since the charter at San Francisco was agreed, you know, is going to be smaller and thriftier than it's been in years. And, you know, when I started early in my UN career as a young field officer in the refugee organization, the High Commissioner for Refugees, you know, we had very deep partnerships with both international and local NGOs. There were a very small handful of us who worked directly for the UN, and it was through this network of partnerships that we carried out our mission. And everybody wanted to work under the blue flag because it provided you a degree of personal security and legitimized your presence on the war zone of the day, at that time the Thai-Cambodian border, but over my career, many others from Central America to the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. And it was a wonderful partnership of, as I say, ambitious young Brits and Americans and many other nationalities coming and probably in all cases learning much more than they were able to give, but working with the local Red Cross societies and others. And over time, the UN bit has grown and grown and grown and grown. And I was very struck when UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, as a result of these cuts, has had to lay off staff, that their first round of layoffs was more than the total staff of the organization when I worked for it. And so the thing has just gotten completely outsized. And, you know, the UN's impact does not depend on numbers. It is actually better if it is a small, high-quality, meritocratic organization which minimizes political interference in its recruitment and staffing, which has been a curse of it, and, you know, takes on a few key tasks like humanitarian provision, which is particularly well suited because of its diplomatic and peace-building capabilities as well, and a few other tasks, but stops being this sprawling everything and therefore nothing to anybody. The analogy that Andrew gave of if you walked into his constituency, nobody knowing what the UN does. So I think, you know, cutting it right back to some key missions which are relevant today, is, absolutely key, along with a lot of very utilitarian, useful things like running the international postal system or the system of air control around the world, which allows us to fly safely. A lot of those sort of mundane tasks, or the World Health Organization's, pandemic alert systems around the world. So this combination of, the sort of running the drain pipes of a global system, together with some high-profile tasks that the young voter in Sutton Coldfield would immediately understand the relevance of, is, I think, key. Now, turning, if I may, as you asked, Nabila, to the World Bank and the IMF, here's a different issue. Here are two institutions founded actually a year before the UN, in 1944, by a group of finance ministers. The conference in the Bretton Woods Mountains of New England was a very small gathering of finance ministers and finance officials. The brilliant geniuses there were John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, and an American counterpart who'd sort of basically written the document even before they got there. They deliberately chose these mountains in the middle of nowhere so that civil society couldn't come and demonstrate, that the finance ministers could write a system for the future of international finance, which wasn't troubled by characters in sandals and T-shirts showing up and making trouble. In San Francisco, God bless it, if you think San Francisco's civil society is just a feature of the last few decades, look at the scenes in 1945. There was one woman delegate in Bretton Woods, one lady economist from Vassar. There were dozens of women critical to what happened, hundreds probably, in San Francisco. It was a totally different thing, and it produced a very different institution, the UN. But go back to what those financial geniuses did in 1944. They pulled the biggest piece of wool over the eyes of the world that they built a system of financing of these institutions where they said to governments, pay in a little bit of capital, but make it just 10% of the amount you're willing to contribute if you have to, but the rest is going to be called callable capital, and you'll never be asked to pay it in. And so you're just going to pay in 10%, so we have some stuff to work, capital to work with. And then we're going to go to the world's financial markets and borrow against that callable guarantee. And it has created the most brilliant financing model ever, which has led to trillions of dollars of money raised and invested in development and in stabilizing financial crises, the task of the IMF. And today, that system is now more vital than ever because the grant-based ODA system, overseas development assistance, as we've heard earlier in this conversation, is kaput, other than for the most needy countries and the humanitarian crises. And so we're going to rely on this model. And now I come to one thing we've really not acknowledged in the conversation yet, which is developing countries are not as unhappy about that as you might expect. They were devastated about the immediate cuts in aid, the impact on lives from people not getting their antiretrovirals or food. But in the longer term, they'd grown exasperated with a system where the donors decided what the priorities were, where the donors would give the money next year, and then Andrew would lose his job, a Labour minister would replace him, who'd have a completely different set of priorities. And if you're the minister in Malawi or Bolivia, you had to sort of do a U-turn and say, okay, we'll drop education, now we want to do health, or we want to do bridges or roads, because that's what the British minister will give us money for. And, it's a little bit, before he takes me on this, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much. And what they like about the World Bank lending model, even though they have to pay it back, for the bank to be able to sustain that credit rating, is that it allows them at its best to make their own choices about their development strategies and make long-term investment decisions against it. And if there's one thing I can tell you after now close to 5 decades in and out of international development, is the only thing that matters in successful development, or a lot of things matter, but the most decisive thing is countries where the political government of the day manages to set a development path for the country which has broad support and which will last across generations. Just very quickly, if you look at the development successes of recent decades, China, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, arguably, move to a region like Africa, and it's countries like Morocco or Botswana, and to Latin America, Chile, many others. In the case of all of them, they're not democracies. Some are, many are not. But what they do have in common is consistency of government across a long period of time. And you need a development financing model which allows that. And actually, ultimately, it's not a grant-giving model because that's always subject to the whims of the givers. It is a loan model which allows the borrower to be in charge of their own development choices.
So Mitchell, if you can keep your response brief, because I would like to take it to the audience, and then you can perhaps attack that from.
No, I wouldn't want to attack it. And going back just to the first part of what Mark said about the reform of the UN. At the moment, it's incredibly difficult because there are people there who spent their entire career making sure that things don't happen. And on the current model with the veto and so forth, it's incredibly hard to make progress. But at the end of the day, if the UN didn't exist, we would have to invent it. And also, when there is agreement on critical issues, and you can think of 2 or 3 over the last 20 years, it does impose awesome legitimacy when it agrees that something needs to happen. So I think, focusing on the international system so that it's understandable to the person in the 3 tons in Sutton Coldfield is an important test of authority and of guaranteeing that its future is one that means something. So turning to the other point that was made, I agree with much of what Marcus said. I think that international development is long-term or it is nothing, which is effectively what you say is absolutely right. We published a white paper, which I insisted, against the wishes really of Downing Street, was an all-party white paper. It was launched by Rishi Sunak in November 2023. It was an all-party paper. The Labour Party, they didn't actively endorse it, but they were part of it, they were consulted. It addresses these points about long-termism, and it addresses these points about partnership. And you're hearing from some African countries in particular that, well, we don't really want handouts, we want investment. And of course that's true, and CDC, now called BII, which this year will invest £750 million in the poorest countries in the world. This is not loan debt. This is equity. This is money that our taxpayers through BII are investing, and they are employing directly BII more than 1 million people. That's food on 1 million tables in poor countries. Countries do want all of that, but be careful of it, because in the end, the investment won't work unless you're also investing in the human capital of education and healthcare. And so it's not often quite as simple as it's sometimes portrayed. People who don't like development say, well, they don't want it, so give them investment. But it has to be seen, I think, in that context.
We could continue these questions. I had a whole other list of questions that could continue us well into the afternoon, but I do want to open it up to the audience to see if there are any questions in the audience. And I think, Austin, you have a mic. There's a gentleman right there, and first there, and then here. Oh, we'll come to you second.
Thank you very much. It seems appropriate on Armed Forces Day to ask your respective views on the potential evolution of our military capability in the future to support the ideas that you were investigating then. I very much like your idea, Andrew, of the Marshall Plan for North Africa to go upstream, as it were, of the problem that we have with the boat people. And Lord Malloch Brown, your ideas of sustainability, of support to developing countries. All of this, of course, in a context where there is an absolute explosion of population in the next 50 years in the African continent, which will challenge us in so many ways. I'm interested to know your views on how we should evolve our military capability to support that. Support of DFID, perhaps, or in support of the United Nations institutions.
Well, first of all, I think that it was, although it's the most popular thing he has done, it was very misleading, indeed disingenuous, to say we're going to solve the defence problem by cutting from point 5 to point 3 and giving it to defence. Because, as I said, defence is the other development is the other side of the coin from defence, for the reasons I made earlier. And never forget what General Mattis said, who was Trump's defence secretary in his first presidency, who said to the president, if you cut development aid, I have to order more ammunition. So I think there's been a simplification of these issues in Britain, which is simply not true. I also think that the templates have moved on the last 80 years when American defense of Europe has been absolutely rock solid, and in Europe we existed under the American nuclear umbrella. There was, during the Cold War, the policy of mutually assured destruction. All of that has changed now, and it may be that Trump is mellowing, and of course other American presidents were scathing about the Europeans, particularly the Germans, not stepping up to the mark in paying for defense. But something is very different. I think for many of us, the scene in the Oval Office with Zelensky, which felt like an episode of Tom Brown's School Days in terms of bullying, was a hell of a shock and a wake-up moment. The Americans voting in the UN against their traditional allies, alongside the Russians and the North Koreans, I think, was a deeply, profoundly shocking moment. So things have changed on defence, and there's no doubt at all that NATO, and Britain is the sort of leading European nation in NATO, has got to recognise that it must defend itself. So I think that's the main point that your question was raising on defence. So I would say, first of all, we've got to defend ourselves, and secondly, we must be more honest and clear-sighted about the link between defence and development. And one of the best things that the Cameron government did, in my view, was to set up the National Security Council. And I sat on it as the development secretary. It brought together the senior ministers in the cabinet who dealt with defence, diplomacy and development. It wired them together. And it gave a real focus to a holistic approach to British foreign policy and defence and development. Subsequently, Johnson didn't use it properly, Mrs May didn't use it very much, and we'll see whether the current government uses that institutional mechanism. But they should, because that is where you will get the answer to the question you posed.
Very quickly, there's more conflict in the world now today than at any time since 1945, and I anticipate that will only grow. I think the UK is exactly got the kind of capabilities that it can play a critical peacekeeping role in what will be an era, sadly, of more conflict. Therefore, but all the more reason, therefore, to put itself on the side of the argument I described of a rival system to this big power one, of a rule of laws and of UN-approved peacekeeping operations rather than ones put together at the White House around protecting special mining interests in the DRC and Rwanda, to just pick up the latest madness to have surfaced. Let me, for the interest of other questions, leave it there, except to just fully endorse Andrew's point that robbing Peter to pay Paul in terms of money from development into defence is a terrible thing to do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you three of you very much for your comments already. I just want to add one extra point. I'm newly back after 20 years of living in the Middle East, North Africa, majority in Cairo in finance. And what I'd say, I just want to mention, Professor Mitchell, your point about the plan. We discussed this. I think that's partly the EBRD responsibilities of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. My concern with many of these institutions is the box ticking to please, as Malloch Brown mentioned, to please what we want rather than what's always wanted on the ground to really help. And that's perhaps for a discussion for another day. But I'd like to come back to one of the key points on the issue of democracy and the Great Unravelling. After 20 years away, I've come back and seen what I call a convergence of dissonance, where there's an enormous fragmentation. But actually, that's also happening abroad. And what I think there is a loss of trust everywhere. We see it here, and you were talking about the structure of politics, which I think we do need to rebuild bottom up and top down, what that means for us and for our friends, although I'd use perhaps Scandinavia as a better example than many. But also, I think that what we've seen recently, Gaza, is, amongst other issues, is an international rules-based order which does not exist, and perhaps only existed for a few. So I think that if we want to really help rebuild Britain, we need, I think, discussions like this, but over a whole day or a few days across the UK, to try to build again trust and improve the quality of those engaged in politics and engage abroad. And if I give one little example of what I learned in Egypt, is that I was very lucky to meet many diplomats over time to discuss regional issues and economies, but also socially. And there was a significant ambassador from Europe, I won't say which one, I don't want to embarrass him, but who said that he always looked to Westminster as an example of the best form of politics and engagement and oratory. And a few years ago he said that just vanished, it's gone. And I think we have to look at that. We all play a part in that rebuilding, but we have also played a part in its breaking apart. And I think we all have to look at what we want for the future and not just complain about it, but do something. And I really hope we can continue these discussions, perhaps with some better goals. But thank you very much.
Thank you for those comments. So essentially, just to summarize, because I think the volume was a little short, it's that, sort of we have an essential role to play in the restoration of trust in democratic values and to re-establishing those democratic norms. There's a question right here, and then we'll go to the gentleman over there, time allowing.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good question, by the way. Larry Diamond at the Center for the Rule of Law and Democracy at Stanford said the only way in which you have democracy is if you have economic equality, you have periods of fiscal growth, and you have some kind of a... When you look at contemporary Britain, what you actually have is rising inequality. That is essentially fueling the far-right demagogues, because you actually are marginalizing people. People no longer trust the political system. So the centralist party, if there's something like Stammerism, by having austerity, he's handing over all his marginal seats to Mr. Farage daily. It ain't gonna work. And so what you essentially have in Britain is you have a country that's bust, basically. And you have a country which promised you pensions, education, and healthcare. All that can't be afforded anymore. It's all well and good to get a university education, but it's going to cost you tens of thousands of pounds. It's all well and good to go to the theater. Can you afford the tickets? In marginalizing people, you're promoting the inequality, and you're creating a society where the far-right demagogues like Farage will take control. I'd love to hear your comments.
Well, just if I can there's a potpourri of questions from the first question. If I can just pick out a couple of things. Firstly, on the box-ticking exercise, I do urge you to look at this white paper that we published, because, it absolutely makes clear that that is not the way development works. If you have a box-ticking exercise, the recipients of development aid will always tick the right boxes because they know what they have to do to get the money. And therefore, genuine partnership is the only way these things work. We have moved miles in that direction over the last couple of decades. And it's worth seeing what that says, because both the major political parties currently in Britain have accepted that. To your point about giving seats to Farage and about the Westminster, to your point about the Westminster system, you know, I think there are difficulties. I think the executive has too much power over Parliament. There's been a sustained removal of power from the backbenches, which the recent welfare thing suggests there might be an optimistic way of viewing that, about it being reversed. But I think there are problems over accountability at Westminster with the executive being too powerful. But on the other hand, if you look at the assisted dying debate, in my 40 years nearly in the House of Commons, that was a great day for Westminster Parliament. You know, as the debate took place, very, very good debate. At the end of it, with the vote, no crowing from the victorious side. I mean, I think it was Parliament at its best. So don't become too cynical about Westminster. Westminster is capable of renewing itself in the way that both of you were discussing. And I hope very much that will happen. Thirdly and finally, you know, one of the big problems in Britain is that Labour and Conservative politicians both have gone along with this British desire to have low American taxes and high European social provision, getting a quart out of a pint pot. You can't go on doing that forever. And that's what both Labour and the Tories have done. They've tried to insist that you can balance that equation, and you can't. And really, politics means a more honest conversation about levels of taxation and levels of social provision. And the fiasco about Labour's reforms on welfare, where they've broken the golden rule. I was a social security minister in 1995, dealing with welfare matters in what was then the Department of Social Security. And the first law of any reform of welfare is you cannot take money that has been granted of very poor people. It won't work. They will agitate with a member of Parliament, and it will fall down. So we do need better government. We do need to, I think, address those two particular points I mentioned en route to getting better government.
And the gentleman right there, and that will be the final question.
You put increased disreliance on aid and reductions in the level of aid commitments in the context of populism and disgruntlement. I'd just like to ask your comments on another context, which is that aid isn't always money well spent, and that voice comes from many other voices other than populist people, especially regarding the skewed interests, corporate interests in the West, and corruption in receiving countries. I'd wish to comment on that context too, which is an increasing voice of a critique of some of the previous aid models.
Well, look, I mean, you know, in a way, it was the implication of my point that, you know, African governments have not risen up to protest the cuts in aid in the full-blooded way that many might have anticipated, because, as I said, you know, while really concerned about the immediate threat to life of suspended health and food security programs, they actually agree with you know, the critics that aid isn't a way of producing financial resources to allow them to carry out their own development strategies. They have seen the distortions. I sort of chose to focus on the distortion of when governments change and come in with their own new priorities in donor countries. But you're completely right. You know, business interests and others are equally distortions. And you know, I am old enough to remember that when DFID, the Department of International Development, was created, it was because of a scandal that had occurred under a Tory government where development monies had been used to build a dam in Malaysia, which was thought to be connected to also winning a contract for selling Malaysia military equipment. And, you know, that scandal led to the creation of DFID because the new Labour government said we are going to separate development choices from national political interests. We're going to say, we're going to put our money where it can do the most to reduce poverty. It is going to be value-based, not national interest-based. And, steadily over time, that has gotten, undermined because it is very hard to preserve that neutrality. Now, I have a particular theory about how that neutrality of aid is best protected, and that is through spending it multilaterally, not through national development ministries. I feel that now that countries like Britain have cut to 0.3, they have absolutely no right to retain development offices around the world and tell countries, we want you to do this with our diminutive British pound contribution. Instead, they should put it into UNICEF, to use the example Andrew gave, or into the World Bank IDA program, and pool it with the money from other donors so it can be strategically deployed and countries get one pool of money, not lots of pools with lots of conditions and, if you like, lots of meddling from corporate or other interests. So, again, I hope out of this meltdown of aid, we can reform how it is used in a way which genuinely protects its professionalism and independence and the integrity of it.
Just three very quick points. I mean, I accept entirely what Mark says about DFID's foundation, but I would argue that every penny of British aid money is spent in British national interest, Britain's national interest, because of what it does to try and stop conflict, build prosperity, help people who are caught up in desperate poverty. So I think the national interest argument does not conflict with what Mark was saying. And my final point I want to make really is this, that public support for what we're talking about has massively eroded. I remember taking, with David Cameron's permission, to a meeting of the Shadow Cabinet, the 6 biggest charities, NGOs in Britain, Save the Children, Christian Aid, Water Aid, all the ones you would expect, and Oxfam. And during the course of that Shadow Cabinet meeting, the head of Oxfam said to the Shadow Cabinet then, this is 2005, 6, 7, if you go back on your promise on the 0.7, we will put 1 million people on the streets. And I was absolutely delighted that she said that. And in those days, you could have done that because there was such public support for development. That does not exist today. The NGOs and those 6 charities, to a greater or lesser extent, have lost enormous amounts of public support. You see it in their funding, which has gone down very severely. That public support doesn't exist, and people have, in a way, have found them out, that they are only really interested in raising money for their own projects. And that, to me, underlines why there has been such a drop-off in support for things that indirectly and directly, Mark and I have spent much of our working lives trying to promote. The final point I wanted to make was this. When it comes to whether you use the multilateral system or bilateral, and I completely accept, given the position today, pooling funds with other countries is the right way to do it. The mentality of a British minister responsible for taxpayers' money, the hard-earned taxpayer pound, to have the most effect is on value for money. And so, in my view, a British minister should, looking between the multilateral system or the bilateral system, should ask what is the best effect for British taxpayers' money in delivering the results that we want. And that should really be the guiding star.
Thank you. I think all we've done is defined the crisis and then redefined it and then again called it a crisis. But I'm so grateful and so privileged to have spent this time with you. And I know, and I'm thankful to you all for your patience. I know we are over time, but thank you for joining us. And please join me in thanking both of our esteemed speakers.